Dawn painted the sky in soft pastels as Judge Thompson sat in his home office, Sarah Martinez's case file open before him. Sleep had eluded him since witnessing her nighttime mission. His morning coffee grew cold, forgotten, as he pored over 15 years of similar parking citations issued in that area. The leather chair creaked as he leaned back, removing his reading glasses to rub his tired eyes. The wall before him displayed his achievements: law school diploma, judicial appointment, civic awards. Yet this morning they seemed to ask questions rather than provide answers. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen at the youth center. "Thought you might want to know. Sarah helped 2 more kids find housing last night. One just started his first job." The judge placed the phone down slowly, his mind traveling back to the countless times he'd imposed fines on similar parking instances. Rising from his desk, he moved to the window overlooking his carefully tended garden. The morning light caught the dew on the roses his wife had planted years ago. She'd always told him that justice without compassion was like a garden without flowers. Technically correct, but missing its heart. "The law is clear," he murmured to himself, a phrase he'd used thousands of times from the bench. But now other images crowded his mind. Sarah's worn briefcase full of hope and help, teenagers finding trust in her steady presence, the quiet dignity with which she accepted his ruling despite its impact on her vital work. His grandson's picture sat on the windowsill, the boy's smile bright and secure. How many children Sarah's age were out there right now, without such security? How many found their way to better lives through her late-night interventions in that restricted parking zone? Judge Thompson returned to his desk, pulling out the city planning maps he'd requested yesterday. The restricted parking area had been designated 20 years ago, when that section of downtown housed busy nightclubs. Now most of those buildings stood empty or repurposed. The original reasoning for the parking restrictions no longer matched current reality. His notepad filled with ideas as the morning progressed. Each potential solution revealed new complications, yet he kept writing. Special permits would need criteria, oversight, accountability. Changes to parking zones would require traffic studies, council approval, public hearings. The bureaucratic challenges loomed large, but for the first time in years, he felt the excitement of tackling a problem that truly mattered. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. His clerk entered with the day's docket, but paused at the sight of papers spread across every surface. "Sir, the morning session begins in an hour," she reminded him gently. Judge Thompson nodded, gathering his thoughts. In a few hours, he would don his robes and return to the bench, where clear rules and established precedents awaited. But something had shifted inside him. The law, he realized, was meant to serve justice, and sometimes justice required looking beyond the letter of the regulation to its spirit. He carefully placed Sarah's file in his briefcase. Today he would uphold the law as always, but tomorrow he would begin the work of ensuring that the law truly served all members of their community, even those whose good works happened in restricted parking zones after midnight. The marble floors of the historic downtown courthouse echoed beneath Sarah Martinez's sensible shoes as she made her way through the security checkpoint. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her worn leather briefcase on the conveyor belt, but her eyes remained clear and determined. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the building's ornate interior. At 32, Sarah carried herself with a quiet grace that seemed to transcend her current predicament. Her simple navy blazer, purchased from a thrift store years ago, had become her armor for difficult days like this one. The contents of her briefcase told the real story of her life's work: dozens of case files, emergency contact numbers, and granola bars she kept for the hungry young people she encountered in her work. As she found her way to Courtroom 3B, Sarah couldn't help but notice the diverse crowd of people waiting their turn before Judge Robert Thompson. Some appeared nervous, others resigned, but Sarah maintained her characteristic calm, mentally reviewing the explanation she had prepared for her case. Judge Robert Thompson's reputation preceded him in the halls of justice. Known for his fair but unwavering adherence to the law, He had served on the bench for 15 years. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appearance of wisdom that matched his experience, though few had seen the warmth that occasionally softened his stern demeanor. When Sarah's name was called, she approached the bench with measured steps. The courtroom's hushed atmosphere seemed to intensify as Judge Thompson looked up from his docket. Something in Sarah's bearing caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she stood, straight-backed but not rigid, or the gentle intelligence in her eyes that met his directly. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you're here regarding multiple parking instances in a restricted area." He paused, studying the document before him. 3 occurrences, all between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Sarah nodded, her response clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor." She held a small folder containing her documentation, waiting for permission to explain further. The morning light shifted, casting a warm glow across the courtroom. Judge Thompson noticed the slight fraying at the cuff of Sarah's blazer, the practical shoes that spoke of long hours spent on her feet, and the way she held herself, not with defiance, but with quiet purpose. "Would you care to explain these late-night parking choices?" he asked, his tone maintaining its professional distance, while carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers lightly touching the folder she held. "Your Honor, I work in the downtown area, and my hours can be unpredictable. I always try to follow parking regulations, but sometimes—" She paused, choosing her words carefully, not wanting to make excuses, but hoping to convey the reality of her situation. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued by her measured response. In his years on the bench, he had developed an intuition about people, and something about Sarah Martinez struck him as different from the usual parade of traffic offenders. The courtroom remained silent, the morning sunlight continuing its slow dance across the wooden panels as Judge Thompson prepared to deliver his ruling. Neither he nor Sarah could have guessed how this seemingly routine morning would set in motion events that would transform their community in unexpected ways. The antique courthouse clock marked each passing second with a gentle tick as Judge Thompson reviewed Sarah's case file. Morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the otherwise solemn courtroom. He noticed Sarah's hands folded neatly before her, steady despite the circumstances. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Thompson began, adjusting his reading glasses, "I see here that this isn't your first time parking in this particular area." He paused, examining the photographs attached to the file. The images showed her modest sit-in parked in the same spot on 3 separate occasions, each time in the depths of night. Sarah's voice remained steady as she responded, "No, Your Honor. I understand the seriousness of these instances." Her right hand unconsciously touched the sleeve of her blazer, a gesture that didn't escape the judge's notice. The leather briefcase at her feet seemed to hold secrets he couldn't quite decipher. From his elevated position behind the bench, Judge Thompson observed the subtle details that 20 years of experience had taught him to notice. The way Sarah stood, not with defiance or unnecessary humility, but with quiet dignity. Her clothes were clean and professional, yet showed signs of careful wear. The kind of wear that spoke of someone who had other priorities for their money. The courtroom's natural acoustics carried the sound of shuffling papers as he reviewed the final details. Each photograph had been taken by parking enforcement, 11:42 p.m., 1:15 a.m., 2:03 a.m. The restricted area was clearly marked, the signage visible even in the nighttime shots. "These are significant hours to be downtown," he remarked, his tone neutral but interested. "Most businesses in that area are closed by then." Sarah nodded, her response measured. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm aware of the business hours." She seemed to weigh her next words carefully, as if deciding how much to reveal. "My work sometimes requires unusual hours." The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting shorter shadows across the courtroom floor. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully with his handkerchief. In his peripheral vision, he could see the court clerk watching with subtle interest, Something about this case felt different from the usual morning traffic docket. Ms. Martinez, the law regarding restricted parking areas exists for specific reasons, he stated, replacing his glasses. Safety, access for emergency vehicles, maintaining order in our downtown area. He paused, noting how Sarah maintained eye contact, accepting his words without argument. The fine schedule lay before him, clear in its requirements. 3 violations within a 30-day period. $300. It was a straightforward case, the kind he'd ruled on hundreds of times before. Yet something about Sarah's quiet presence made him take an extra moment before speaking. The court finds that the violations did occur as documented, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The standard fine of $300 is hereby imposed, to be paid within 30 days. Sarah's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained clear. Thank you, Your Honor. I understand. She reached for her weathered briefcase, her movements deliberate and dignified. As she turned to leave, Judge Thompson noticed a paper that had slipped partially from her case, a logo glimpsed briefly before she tucked it away. Something about youth services, though he couldn't make out the details. It was a small detail, one that would have normally gone unnoticed, but it lingered in his mind as he called the next case. Evening had settled over the city like a gentle blanket when Judge Thompson arrived at the Hope Youth Center's annual celebration. The brick building glowed with warm light from within, and the sounds of laughter and music spilled onto the street. He straightened his tie, feeling slightly out of place without his judicial robes. The invitation had come from a colleague on the city council, suggesting that seeing the center's work might provide valuable insight for his upcoming committee position on urban development. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods welcomed him into a transformed space. The center's main room buzzed with activity. Colorful artwork decorated the walls, each piece signed by young artists who had found their voice here. Tables lined with refreshments attracted clusters of people, teenagers, volunteers, and community leaders all mingling together with unusual ease. That's when he saw her. Sarah Martinez stood across the room, but she was almost unrecognizable from the woman who had stood before his bench that morning. Her face glowed with animation as she spoke with a small group of teenagers. The worn briefcase was still by her side, but now it sat open, revealing notebooks and resources she shared freely with the young people gathered around her. Judge Thompson found himself moving closer, drawn by the scene unfolding before him. A young girl, perhaps 16, wiped tears from her eyes as Sarah gently squeezed her shoulder. Another teenager proudly showed Sarah what appeared to be a school report card, and the genuine joy on Sarah's face matched the student's own. "That's our miracle worker," the voice said beside him. Judge Thompson turned to find the center's director, Dr. Chen, smiling at the scene. "Sarah's been with us for 5 years now. She's here almost every night, sometimes until dawn, helping these kids find their way." The pieces began falling into place in Judge Thompson's mind. The late-night parking violations, the worn clothes, the quiet dignity in his courtroom. He watched as Sarah pulled a granola bar from her briefcase for a hungry teen, the same briefcase she had clutched before his bench hours earlier. "Every night?" he asked, his judicial demeanor temporarily forgotten. Dr. Chen nodded. "She knows this is when they need her most, when the sun goes down and they have nowhere else to turn. Last month alone, she helped 3 teenagers find safe housing and got 5 others back into school." He paused, pride evident in his voice. "She uses her own car to drive them to appointments, interviews, sometimes even to the emergency room." The music and chatter faded into the background as Judge Thompson observed Sarah in her element. She moved from group to group, clearly knowing each young person's story, their struggles, their triumphs. Her laughter rang genuine, her concern authentic, her presence a beacon of stability for these young lives. A teenage boy approached Sarah with a sheet of paper, his hands trembling slightly. Judge Thompson watched as she stopped everything to focus completely on him, her eyes lighting up as she read whatever was on the page. The boy's nervous expression transformed into a bright smile at her reaction. In that moment, standing in the warm light of the youth center, Judge Thompson felt the weight of the day's earlier judgment pressing against his conscience. The $300 fine he had imposed, standard and fair by the court's metrics, now took on a different meaning entirely. He realized that sometimes justice needed to see beyond its own rigid boundaries to serve its true purpose. The next evening, Judge Thompson sat in his parked car at the edge of Madison Square, his curiosity having gotten the better of his usual routine. The clock on his dashboard read 11:30 p.m. The same restricted parking area where Sarah had received her citation stretched before him, now bathed in the amber glow of streetlights. Right on cue, Sarah's modest sedan pulled up. Through his windshield, he watched as she expertly maneuvered into the spot, her movements suggesting years of practice. From his position, he could see her gather several bags from her trunk, the contents creating irregular shapes beneath the plastic. A small group of teenagers emerged from the shadows of a nearby building. Instead of scattering at her approach, they moved toward her with obvious trust. Even from a distance, Judge Thompson could see their faces brighten as Sarah greeted each one by name. She set up her mobile office on a nearby bench, spreading out what appeared to be fresh sandwiches and hot beverages. One by one, the teenagers approached her, some sitting close, others maintaining a careful distance. Sarah seemed to understand each one's needs instinctively, matching their energy and respecting their boundaries. A young man in a threadbare jacket approached hesitantly. Judge Thompson watched as Sarah reached into her ever-present briefcase, producing what looked like official documents. She spent several minutes explaining something to the boy, her gesture animated but gentle. The teenager's posture gradually relaxed as she spoke, hope replacing anxiety in his expression. Two girls huddled together nearby caught Sarah's attention. She beckoned them closer, speaking in what appeared to be soothing tones. From one of her bags, she produced clean blankets and what looked like personal care items. The girls accepted these offerings with visible relief, one of them impulsively hugging Sarah before quickly stepping back. Through his car window, Judge Thompson could see Sarah's exhaustion in the way she occasionally rubbed her neck or stifled a yawn. Yet her energy never flagged when interacting with the young people. Each one received her full attention, whether they needed help with paperwork, medical advice, or simply a sympathetic ear. A police car cruised by slowly, and Judge Thompson noticed how some of the teenagers tensed. Sarah stood calmly, exchanging a wave with the officer. Her presence seemed to serve as a bridge between these young people and the official world they often feared. As midnight stretched toward morning, Sarah began what appeared to be a familiar routine. She made sure everyone had her phone number, confirmed safe sleeping arrangements were possible, and distributed cards with emergency contact information. Some of the teenagers disappeared into the night, while others waited as Sarah made phone calls, presumably to shelters or safe houses. Finally, around 1:30 a.m., she packed up her supplies. The remaining teenagers helped her clean the area, leaving it spotless. Judge Thompson watched as she gave final hugs and fist bumps to those still present, her care for each one evident in every gesture. Before getting into her car, Sarah paused to make notes in a small notebook. Documenting the night's work, he realized. The dedication required to maintain such detailed records after an exhausting night struck him forcefully. Here, in the quiet hours most people spent sleeping, Sarah Martinez was quietly changing lives, one conversation at a time. The parking ticket from that morning still lay on her dashboard, visible even from where he sat. $200 that could have bought more blankets, more food, more resources for these young people who clearly needed them. Judge Thompson adjusted his tie as he waited in City Hall's marble lobby. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating the space where he'd spent countless hours over his career. Today felt different. Today, he carried Sarah Martinez's story with him, along with a carefully prepared proposal that had kept him working late into the night. The elevator chimed, and Councilwoman Eleanor Chen stepped out, her brisk walk slowing as she recognized him. "Robert, this is unexpected. Don't you have court this morning?" "I've taken a personal day, Eleanor," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of purpose. "I need to discuss something important with you and the Transportation Committee." Minutes later, in a sunlit conference room overlooking the city square, Judge Thompson spread his research across the polished table. Traffic studies, demographic reports, and photographs of Sarah's nighttime work formed a compelling narrative. "We're dealing with outdated regulations," he explained, pointing to a map marked with highlighted zones. "These parking restrictions were designed for a different era. Now they're hindering essential community service work." Eleanor leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Go on." Judge Thompson shared Sarah's story, carefully omitting identifying details, but painting a vivid picture of dedication meeting unnecessary obstacles. He described the young lives being transformed, the critical hours when help was most needed, and the impact of rigid parking rules on this vital work. "What exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor asked, her decades of political experience evident in her measured tone. He pulled out a draft proposal, the product of his sleepless nights, a special access program. "We identify legitimate organizations doing after-hours community work. Create a permitting system that allows them to park in these zones during specific hours. Include accountability measures, regular reviews, clear guidelines." The morning sun climbed higher as they discussed details. Other committee members arrived, drawn by Eleanor's urgent messages. Each brought different perspectives: public safety concerns, budget implications, enforcement challenges. Judge Thompson met each question with carefully prepared responses. He'd anticipated objections, researched solutions, found precedents from other cities. His judicial experience served him well as he built his case, point by point. "This isn't just about parking," he explained, his passion breaking through his usual reserve. "It's about removing barriers that prevent good people from helping our most vulnerable citizens." As the discussion progressed, he noticed a shift in the room. Skepticism gave way to engagement. Questions changed from "why should we?" to "how can we?" Eleanor tapped her pen thoughtfully against the table. "We'll need to draft proper legislation. Set up meetings with affected departments. Transportation, police, social services." "I prepared initial drafts," Judge Thompson replied, producing another folder. "And I've spoken with key department heads. They're willing to participate in a pilot program." The meeting stretched into the afternoon. Coffee cups emptied and filled again. Notes covered whiteboards, but with each passing hour, possibility took clearer shape. As the session wound down, Eleanor turned to him with newfound respect. "I've known you for 20 years, Robert. I've never seen you like this." He gathered his materials, thinking of Sarah's quiet dignity in his courtroom, of teenagers finding hope in the middle of the night, of rules that needed to evolve to serve justice. "Sometimes," he replied, "we need to look beyond what we've always done to see what we should be doing." Sunlight spilled across the conference room table where Sarah Martinez sat, her eyes wide with surprise as Judge Thompson explained the purpose of their meeting. The room, normally reserved for judicial conferences, felt less formal today, with city planners, social workers, and transportation officials gathered around the table. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Thompson began, his tone warmer than it had been in the courtroom weeks ago, "we've asked you here because your work has inspired something important." He gestured to the documents spread before them, each page representing hours of careful planning. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of her familiar briefcase, now resting beside detailed maps of downtown parking zones. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and caution. Eleanor Chen, the councilwoman, stepped forward with a warm smile. "We're creating a new access program for night workers like yourself, people who serve our community during those crucial after-dark hours. And we need your expertise to make it work." Color rose in Sarah's cheeks as understanding dawned. The judge watched as she processed this information, noting how she straightened in her chair, professional instincts taking over. What kind of expertise are you looking for? For the next 2 hours, Sarah shared insights that no traffic study could have revealed. She spoke about safe lighting needs, the importance of sight lines for both workers and clients, the delicate balance between accessibility and privacy. Her practical experience transformed abstract plans into viable solutions. The young people I work with, she explained, pointing to a particular intersection, they need to know they can reach us without being too exposed. But we also need to ensure the safety of our workers. Her finger traced a path between locations. These connections matter more than any single parking spot. Judge Thompson noticed how the city planners leaned forward, their pens moving quickly as Sarah highlighted realities their data had missed. The transportation officials nodded at her practical suggestions for permit verification that wouldn't create unnecessary bureaucratic barriers. What about other organizations? Sarah asked, her mind already extending beyond her own needs. There are food bank volunteers, medical outreach teams, crisis counselors. That's exactly why we need your help, Eleanor responded. You understand both sides, the official requirements, and the practical needs. We'd like you to help us create guidelines that work for everyone. As the meeting progressed, Sarah's initial reserve melted into enthusiastic participation. She pulled examples from her years of experience, suggesting solutions to problems the officials hadn't even considered yet. Her practical wisdom complemented Judge Thompson's legal expertise, creating a framework that could serve the entire community. Near the end of the session, Judge Thompson cleared his throat. There's one more thing, Ms. Martinez. He pulled out a formal document. In light of your contribution to this program and your ongoing service to our community, the court has decided to commute your previous fines. Sarah's eyes glistened. Your Honor, that's not necessary. No, he agreed, his voice gentle but firm. But it's right. Sometimes the law needs to recognize when its servants are already fulfilling its highest purpose. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room as the meeting concluded. Plans had taken shape, partnerships had formed, and bridges had been built between the formal world of civic administration and the vital night work that kept their community whole. 1 year later, Judge Thompson stood at the window of his chambers, watching the first snow of winter dust the city streets below. A framed document hung on his wall alongside his other achievements, the official city ordinance establishing the Night Workers Access Program, now celebrated as a model for other cities across the state. His intercom buzzed softly. Your Honor, Sarah Martinez is here for the quarterly review meeting. Sarah entered his office carrying not only her trusted briefcase, but also a thick binder of program data. Her clothes, while still modest, looked newer now that her salary wasn't being drained by parking fines. But her eyes held the same compassionate determination he'd first noticed in his courtroom. The numbers are encouraging, she began, opening her binder. 38 organizations have qualified for the program. Food banks report reaching 40% more people during critical night hours. Medical outreach teams have doubled their coverage areas. Judge Thompson smiled, remembering the long hours spent crafting these regulations. And your own work. Sarah's face brightened. We've helped 27 young people find stable housing this quarter alone. Being able to park safely near their gathering spots has made all the difference. She pulled out a letter. Actually, someone asked me to give you this. The judge unfolded the paper, recognizing the handwriting from permit applications he'd reviewed. It was from Jamie, one of the teenagers he'd seen that night he watched Sarah work. The young man was now enrolled in community college, working part-time, and mentoring others at the youth center. A knock at the door interrupted their meeting. Eleanor Chen entered, bringing with her representatives from 3 other cities eager to learn about the program. Sarah's quarterly reviews had evolved into informal teaching sessions, spreading the ripple effect of their innovation. Tell them about the mobile app, Judge Thompson encouraged, watching Sarah demonstrate the simple system they developed. Night workers could now quickly verify their permits, report safety concerns, and access emergency services when needed, What had begun as a solution to parking fines had grown into a comprehensive support network for the city's after-hours helpers. As Sarah walked the visitors through the program details, Judge Thompson reflected on the transformation of the past year. The restricted parking zones had been reimagined, not as barriers but as designated safe spaces for essential night work. Police officers and social workers collaborated instead of conflicting. The city's rhythm had shifted to acknowledge and support those who served during the darkest hours. Later that evening, he drove downtown, where fresh snow continued to fall. The parking spots that had once been sites of conflict now displayed special signs. Reserved for night service workers, permit required. He watched as a food bank van easily found space near a shelter, its volunteers efficiently unloading supplies without fear of citations. Near his old observation spot, he noticed Sarah's car parked securely under a new street light. She stood with a small group of teenagers, her breath visible in the cold air as she spoke with them. A newly installed emergency call box glowed nearby, its presence both reassuring and symbolic of the city's commitment to its night workers. As he pulled away, Judge Thompson smiled at the simple truth that had emerged from this journey. Justice worked best when it grew from understanding, when it adapted to serve the real needs of real people. In the end, it wasn't about changing laws, it was about changing lives.